most nationally known speaker. She's funny, she's smart, she's compassionate, and she's passionate about helping people. Please welcome Alyce LaViolette.
Way too much fun in Hawaii. Okay, it's an honor to be here. We do some work with 29 Palms, so I'm with General Kelly. I'm really sorry to be here and not at 29 Palms in a Quonset hut. But I wanted to start by reading you something, and it's from a book that I just finished. The book isn't that good, but this quote is pretty good, and it's from a little girl who was talking about her uncle who had come back from World War II. And she said, Aunt Helen had to work after my Uncle Richard came back from World War II. She said he looked just as handsome as when he left, but his mind was still at war. He screamed at night and he couldn't sleep. Sometimes he'd cry. We'd all be eating supper, and Uncle Richard would say, "Won't you all excuse me?" And he'd go out on the porch alone. Uncle Richard always carried a book with him because he said it was the best drug he had to ease pain. Nobody would have guessed he was so banged up inside. I suppose that's the way it was with everyone, really, that line between what's inside and what's outside. They called it battle fatigue in World War II, and when my grandfather came home from World War I and went into the VA hospital, the family said that he had battle fatigue or shell shock. And when I worked at the VA hospital during the Vietnam War, they retitled it post-traumatic stress disorder. I'm not actually sure it should be called a disorder at all. I think it's a reaction. I think it's a reaction that's so common for people who are thrown into situations that are so atypical for what most of us are prepared for in our lives. And I was watching a documentary the other day, and I thought I would talk to you a little bit about that. It was, and most of you weren't around when John Kennedy was assassinated, but this was a documentary called the Kennedy Detail. And it was about the Secret Service men who were assigned to John Kennedy. And they were interviewed. They're older than I am. They're in their 70s, and I think some of them were in their 80s. And they talked about their experience because they were very much a brotherhood. They were very much a brotherhood like you folks are very much a brotherhood and sisterhood. That there is a core feeling with Secret Service. And they were with the Kennedy family and established relationships with the Kennedy family, and they were with John Kennedy when he was assassinated. And they were interviewed years later, and these are the kinds of things they said. People talk about grieving. We had no time to grieve. Life went on my schedule got busier, but the image of President Kennedy's head exploding has never escaped me. It has never left. I had a very rough time. I should have gone for help. One of the other men said, I got really depressed and I went into a downward spiral. I got physically ill. Too much time to think about what I had experienced. And Bernard Shaw said, for someone to be miserable, they have to have the leisure to do so. So it's when you're back, it's when you're not busy anymore that you actually have the time to think about what's happened. This man said he went to a doctor who was a friend of his who said, you're going to kill yourself if you don't stop drinking. He said, if I had kept contact with the other agents, with my brothers, I would have stayed strong. Because we would have talked to each other, we wouldn't have been isolated. I just thought that was particularly relevant to what you guys go through and you women go through. When you're in a situation and you come back and maybe you're ashamed that you survived, or maybe you're ashamed of what you've done. And I remember listening to young men, and I was, I think, 20 or 21 at the time, when I worked at the Veterans Hospital. And we were students, there were a couple of us, and we would have guys lined up, you know, outside the door. And I don't think it was because I weighed 120 pounds and I was a lot cuter than I am now, but I think it was because we would listen, and we would just listen to what happened. And we were freaked out about listening, but we listened. And we understood that it was a situation that was so different from anything we could relate to, that having to deal with this made their lives so much harder. About 3 years ago, a young man came into my domestic violence group. He was a Marine who had just gotten back from Iraq. He was a really neat young guy. He was about 22 years old. And he said something that I think about a lot. He said more than one thing, but he said a couple things about what had gotten him into this group. He had slapped his girlfriend. They'd gone out clubbing one night, and she was talking to another guy. And he got very jealous. Now, this was not a guy who was usually jealous, but he said that when he was in Iraq, he was with so many of his buddies who'd gotten Dear John letters, that he started wondering about what his girlfriend was doing while he was gone. And so when she was talking to another man, he got jealous. And the second thing was, he said, before I went to Iraq, I thought before I acted. When I got back from Iraq, I acted before I thought. Which makes sense. It makes sense that you have to deal with life a lot differently when you're in a high-stress situation, a combat situation, than you would if you were back at home, where your family expects you to, you know, be on board and all that sort of thing. His girlfriend, by the way, said the same thing. She said he was not a jealous guy. This was not just him saying it. And that he thought before he acted, before he went to Iraq. Now, he related most to a guy in group who I would say was someone, and Judge Alyce talked about this chronic combat readiness that develops in children who are abused. If you've come up in an abusive family, if you've grown up and been exposed to domestic violence, trauma sort of builds on itself, and it's stored differently in the brain than other things. It's harder to erase than other things. So people who grow up in violent families learn a first language, and I don't expect somebody who grows up in an English-speaking family to speak fluent Spanish. I don't expect people who grow up in violent families to actually be able to speak the language of mental health as well. But who this Marine related to was a guy who'd been in the program for quite some time, and he had what I would call chronic combat readiness because he was born into violence. He was actually, and I'll tell you his story because I think it's kind of interesting. He was a guy who was born in prison because his mother was in the mafia. Now, he grew up and got into the mafia as well, the real mafia, the New Jersey mafia. I'm from New Jersey. There's got to be something we're proud of, and so I'm particularly proud that we have the mafia in New Jersey. So this guy was born in prison. He was taken away from his mother at birth. He was placed with family who didn't really kind of want him or had the ability to take care of him, and they put him in an orphanage where he was routinely beaten. And he wound up saying to the priest who beat him the most, if you ever lay a hand on me again, when I get old enough, I'm going to come back here and I'm going to kill you. And he did do that. He went back with some of his mafia buddies to kill this priest. And he said the priest was lucky because he was already dead. But he came into our program, and by the way, he ran away from the orphanage, and probably by the time he was 12 or 13, he was a trained killer. And he spent a lot of time in prison, but he was a really successful guy in a lot of ways. He was the kind of guy who would have made it really well on the outside if he had had the experience of living on the outside and living out of a violent kind of environment. So when he came into our group, he'd been out of jail for quite a while. He was actually a very successful businessman, owned his own company, but he came in because he put a gun in somebody's mouth in a business deal and pulled the gun out, shot himself in the foot, and was so pissed off that he didn't realize he'd been shot in the foot until somebody said to him, "Hey, you got blood coming out of your shoe." And he said, his friend said to him, "I think maybe you've got an anger management problem." And he thought, hey, maybe I do have an anger management problem. So he came in for anger management. And when he came in, the second week he was in group, he got up and he started to go after somebody on the other side of the room. And I got up between them and I said, "Don't make me humiliate you in front of everyone." And, you know, he kind of laughed because he could have done this to me. But he was from New Jersey, I'm from New Jersey, so we had sort of a connection there. But this guy had been with us probably for about 5 months, and we learned some things that were very important about him. One was that he would tend to escalate very quickly, and he would escalate, but he'd come down fairly quickly unless it was like major, and then he could hold a grudge forever. But it had to be a pretty big thing. But he had a hair trigger temper. The second thing was his word was golden to him. If he gave his word, he kept his word. His word was very important to him. So he was in group for about 5 months, and he came in one night, and he was really pissed off, and he said, "This guy owes me $1,500. He hasn't paid me. I'm going to blow his effing kneecaps off." And I said, "Well, you can't do that." And he said, "I'm not doing it. I'm hiring somebody." I have very low standards for success in my program, so I was real pleased that he wasn't doing it himself. But we spent a lot of time with him that night trying to work on ways that he could handle this in a legal kind of way. And I think everybody in the group learned a whole lot that night. They learned what it was like to be in a room with somebody whose anger filled up the room and they had no control over it. They learned that they needed to listen to somebody whose problems were bigger than theirs. They learned that if they were going to talk to him about anything that was going on, they needed to think about what they were going to say before they said it and have the correct timing about when they said it. And so everybody was listening with him, and we worked on a safety plan. Now, as a therapist, you have a duty to warn, but you have to know the intended victim. So we didn't know the intended victim, and he certainly wasn't going to tell us who he was. So we created a safety plan with him, and we got him to give his word. And what he said was he would not do anything violent to this guy within the next week, and that if he started to get really upset and really violent, feeling that he would call either Bill or myself, we did group together, and that he would call us if he was escalating. And the third thing we did was have 3 of his buddies in group call him during the week to make sure about where he was, to check in with him. So we had a safety plan. He came back the next week and he said, "Hey, I took care of it." I said, "Oh, what'd you do?" He said, "I just called the guy. I called him, I said, 'Hey man, I'm in one of those violence groups. It's about everything I can do to hold on to myself.'" He said the guy was over in 15 minutes, paid him everything he owed him. I said, "Nice use of group." But the reason I'm talking about him, besides the fact that the Marine loved this guy and admired him because he was older, was that he had changed so much. That with all those layers of violence, he later came into group and he had a girlfriend who had a stroke. And he said, "I am feeding her and I am bathing her and I am caring for her. I never knew I could be that kind of a man." And he was feeling good about himself. He was feeling proud about himself. And he always said the hardest thing for him to ever do was to talk to anybody about how he felt. So he's practiced. And when you practice, you get better.